In this video, we're going to look at examples of graphs and displays for categorical or qualitative data.
We're going to start by looking at a data set in StatCrunch. You're free to follow along if you'd like to. This data set is called Happiness Data from GSS, and this is a data set that's in our class group on StatCrunch. Looking at the description of this data set, we have quite a few variables in here that are categorical. The first type of display we're going to look at is a frequency distribution, or in StatCrunch we call it a frequency table. And we're going to look at all of these at once. So I'm going to highlight all of those categorical variables. Notice down here that we can do just frequencies, which would just be the numbers of how many are in each category, or we can also have it do relative frequencies. We can have it do percents, or we can have it do a few other things. We're going to use what it automatically gives us, which is frequency and relative frequency. When I clicked on compute, since the income had 25 different categories, StatCrunch sees that many different answers for the income, and it wants to know if we want it to turn on binning. What that would do is it would take some of those categories we already have and put them all together into one category. So it would group the categories into bigger categories. We don't want to do that because we want to look at each category separately. So I'm going to click cancel for that, and that way it won't do that to us. Here are all of our different frequency tables that it just created for us. Here's one for happy. We had the 3 different possible answers. These are the frequencies that give the numbers of respondents that answered each of the 3 different choices. And here we have the relative frequencies. If we wanted to look at percentages, we could take our relative frequencies and multiply by 100 so that it moves the decimal point over 2 places. For example, the number of people that answered number 2, which was the pretty happy choice, was 110. And the relative frequency of that is 0.58, which means that was about 58% of the respondents that gave that answer. We can see the same thing for the health variable. Looking at the frequencies, we can see how many answered number 3. That was the highest frequency. The lowest frequency was number 1. Here we can look at the relative frequencies, or we can think about those as percentages. Now here's the one that it was asking us about, turning on binning, where it would have put some of our categories together. And we didn't have it do that, so we have all of these different categories. One of the things to notice here is that it doesn't list category 1, and it also skips number 6. We have relationship. We can look at the frequencies and the relative frequencies for those answers. And for the variable married, this was a 0 if they're not married and a 1 if they are. You can see looking at these values that these two were very close together. It was close to being half and half as to how many of these were married and how many were not married. And then finally the religious variable. We can see right off that the most popular answer was number 3, which was moderately religious. That had about 42% of the responses. The next thing we're going to look at is bar graphs, and in StatCrunch they call them bar plots. I'm going to graph and bar plot with data because we've got all of the original data in here. And again, it's asking me if I want to turn on binning for the income, and I don't. Here's our bar graph for the happy variable. And this gives us the same information that we got from our frequency table. It gives it to us in a picture form, and a lot of people find it easier to interpret things if they have a graph, if they have a picture, than if they just have a table with numbers in it. This shows us right away that there were a lot more respondents that answered with choice 2 than with either choice 3 or choice 1. Here's the bar graph for the health variable. We can see which category had the highest frequency. The other nice thing in StatCrunch is that if you put your cursor over the bar, it will tell you the actual frequency, and it will also tell you what category that was from. Now, one other thing we can do, if we want StatCrunch to automatically put the frequency above the bar so that we don't have to look it up every time, we can go back to this and check where it says value above bar. When I do that, then it puts the frequencies at the top of the bar for each one. Now here's the bar graph for the income variable. Some of these it didn't even put the value above the bar, I guess just because there were too many for it to do. Just like in the frequency table where it just skipped the ones that had a frequency of 0, this one just skipped the bars where the frequency was 0. So there's not even a category listed for number 6 or for number 1. That's something you really have to watch out for with these. Here's the one for the married variable, and this really points out how close together those two were. And here's the one for the religious variable. The thing that I would notice in this one is that this bar is more than twice as high as the other ones, so the frequency is more than twice as much, and these other three are almost all exactly the same. The other thing that we could do with our bar graphs, we can ask it to do relative frequencies or percents. So now instead of giving us those numbers of how many people answered with this choice, it's giving us the relative frequency. Now, the other thing that we can do with categorical variables is do a variation of a bar graph, which is called a Pareto chart. A Pareto chart, instead of doing the categories in the order that they showed up in the data, it puts the highest bar as the first one to the left and then goes in descending order after that. To do this in StatCrunch, we just do a bar plot, but then where it says order by, we ask it to do count descending. This is something we'd use if we really want to point out which category has the most and which category has the least and how they go in between those two. Sometimes we have two categorical variables and we want to look at the relationship between them, or we want to take some data and split it up by two categorical variables at the same time. So let's do a side-by-side bar plot for two of these categorical variables. The two variables I'm going to pick to look at are married and happy. I'm going to start with married. I'm just selecting married for my column, and then I'm going to have it grouped by the variable happy. What this is going to do is it's going to look at a bar graph for married, but it's going to group it by how they responded to the question about being happy. Here's what that graph would look like. It has two separate parts of the graph for how they answered the married question. So this is all the people that weren't married. This is all the people that were married. And then what we have is relative frequencies. These relative frequencies are overall. Out of all the people in this entire data set, there were 30% of them that were not married and answered that they were pretty happy. If we wanted to know how many of the not married people answered that they were pretty happy, then we'd have to go back and change this a little bit. Here we would want to do either a relative frequency within the category or a percent within the category. This time it's telling us out of all the people that answered that they weren't married, 58.8% of them answered with choice number 2 about being pretty happy. This gives us the percentage just within that category. These are the percentages for these people that were married. There's two different ways to look at the same thing. Now we could also do this going the other direction. If we're still trying to compare married and happy, we could start with happy as our column, then we could group by the married variable. And again, I'm going to have it do the percent within the category. This gives us a different way to look at the same data. This time it's splitting it by how they answered the happy question, and then within each one of those it shows us the comparison between the not married and the married. These two graphs are slightly different and they give us slightly different views of what's going on with this data. The next kind of graphs we're going to look at are pie charts. And pie charts, for the most part, are only appropriate for categorical data. I'm going to create pie charts for all of our categorical variables. For these, you can have it display the count, which would be the frequency, or the percent of the total. It automatically does both if you don't tell it anything different. Here's our pie chart for happy. Pie charts can be useful partly because people are used to pie charts. They're not too hard to understand or interpret. For the happy variable, we can see easily that number 2 had a lot more responses than the other two choices. Here's our pie chart for the health variable. Here's one that's not especially useful for the income variable because there were so many different classes. We have all these ones over here that are just tiny little slices of the pie. This graph doesn't really tell us a whole lot. Here's the one for relationship. We can easily see that the marrieds are pretty close to being half of this data set. Another thing we can do with pie charts is we can look at two different categorical variables at once. So we can do a group by with this also. Let's do relationship, and let's look at how that's related to the happy variable. I'm going to group by happy. What this does is it gives us three different pie charts, one for each different response to happy. This was the ones that said they were not very happy. We can see a lot of those are never married. This one was the pretty happy response, so almost half of those are married. The smallest of these is the separated. And then with the pretty happy, we can see a big percentage of these are married. The next biggest is the ones that were never married. This is kind of an interesting way to break down the responses to these two different questions. To summarize what we just talked about, for our categorical or qualitative data, these are the types of graphs and displays that are appropriate for that type of data. Frequency distributions or frequency tables, bar graphs, in StatCrunch those are called bar plots, Pareto charts where the bars are in order from highest to lowest, side-by-side bar graphs. These are useful if we have two categorical variables or if we want to break down one categorical variable by using another one also, and pie charts.